Ideally, in America, food is a place where families come together. They have the opportunity and the access to buy healthy foods, the knowledge to prepare it, and everyone enjoys eating it, has a full plate of healthy food, and is healthier because of it. Unfortunately, lots of families and lots of kids don't have access to healthy foods. Um, they're in environments that are typically called food deserts, and it's debatable whether or not these cause problems like obesity, but there certainly are areas where it's much, much easier to get food that isn't healthy for you than it is to find food that is healthy for you. Where I worked in Washington, D.C., was right next to a supermarket, but that supermarket hadn't been there until 2 years before I got there, and all the residents and parents of the students I worked with said that they would have to take at least 2 buses previously to get to the grocery store, and then 2 buses to get back, and it was a really long, arduous process, and the produce offered at the grocery stores still weren't um, that exceptional, and they still struggled in that area to find good, healthy food, and it was especially hard because there was just so much unhealthy, fast junk food around, and it was so easy and so tempting for most of them. While it certainly is possible to eat healthy and still eat cheaply, uh, it generally takes a lot more time when you're eating raw foods to prepare and make them, and lots of people, especially working poor, don't have the time to prepare and cook these foods. So oftentimes they fall back on prepared pre-prepared meals and fast food. And some graphs and statistics suggest that the rates of prices are increasing much more rapidly for fresh fruits and vegetables than they are for other more processed foods. This graph shows the percentage increase in foods in the past 30 years. There's currently a really big problem in the United States. We are getting really overweight, and it's leading to a lot of preventable diseases. As shown on the First Lady's website, letsmove.gov, in the past 3 decades, childhood obesity rates have tripled in America. Among African Americans and Hispanics, nearly 40% of the population is overweight or obese. Apparently, if we don't solve this problem, 1/3 of all children born in 2000 or later will suffer from diabetes at some point in their lives, and many others will face chronic obesity-related health problems like heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer, and asthma. The First Lady's website elaborates on why this might be. One of the major reasons is that kids are way too inactive. They spend way more time watching media in front of screens than they do having physical activity. Unbelievably, 8 to 18-year-old adolescents spend an average of 7.5 hours a day in front of screens, while only 1/3 of them get the recommended amount of physical activity. And while they're spending all this extra time in front of screens, they're eating a whole lot of extra food. Apparently, Americans are now eating 31% more calories than they did 40 years ago, including 56% more fats and oils and 14% more sugars and sweeteners. The average American now eats 15 more pounds of sugar a year than in 1970. The picture on the right, I think, does a pretty good job encapsulating this problem, as the narrative I just told would suggest it. The picture on the left is a picture I took last year working in DC, and it's from the 3rd floor of the school I worked in, and it was taken during the recess period. And as you can see, there are no students outside, and this was due to, quote, inclement weather. And recess was canceled quite often at that school due to inclement weather, and much, much less severe conditions than the ones seen in this picture, often just on a whim, it seemed. And this was frustrating as a teacher, not only because I could tell my students really wanted to get outside and they actually had an urge to go play, and that was part of the day they enjoyed the most, but also because when they didn't have the opportunity to expend some of all that energy they had, it made my day a lot more challenging. This little personal anecdote of mine, I think, adds a interesting alternative dimension to what the problem actually is here, that the government websites don't quite address. Michelle Obama took on this problem of childhood health and obesity as her #1 issue almost immediately after her husband took office. In the first spring after the inauguration, Miss Obama planted the first White House garden since Eleanor Roosevelt's Victory Garden during World War II. She started the Let's Move campaign less than a year later. It's common for first ladies to take on righteous missions to better the nation. Miss Obama quickly made it her mission to make America's next generation of children a healthier generation, and she's challenging the rest of the nation to do so as well. One of the most emphasized parts of this Let's Move initiative is for students and young people to get active. The Let's Move website recommends that kids exercise for at least 60 minutes a day. The website encourages families to get active together, and it offers a list of activities they can do if they don't know what they can do to be more active. The initiative encourages parents to get more invested in their children's physical activity and even get more invested in the amount of physical activity the kids have at school. The initiative also targets and encourages schools to get active because when students play for 60 minutes or more a day, it increases their concentration and focus, improves their attitude and behavior, and boosts their academic performance. Another big part of the initiative is the educational component. It aims to educate people on why we're unhealthy and what they can do to make themselves more healthy. But perhaps the biggest aspect of the whole initiative is the eating healthy part. One part of the Eating Healthy initiative is the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, and it aims to finance grocery stores, farmers markets, local vendors to let them offer more fresh produce and healthier foods so more people have access to them. Most of the messages about healthy eating are aimed at moms, families, schools, and communities. While the Let's Move initiative sends a lot of good messages and encourages a lot, that's just about all that its power is, really, is to be able to encourage. It recommends a whole lot of things of schools, of individuals, but it has really very little power to enforce anybody to change their behaviors. There are a few areas, however, where they do have some power, the government does, to make changes and enforce change. One of those is in the schools, and they've done this in a few different ways. One of them is that they've made it mandatory to have recess, so it's actually illegal to take recess away from students. And the other is a restructuring of the school lunch system and the breakfast system called the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. The Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act serves a lot of purposes and does lots of things outside of the school, but the majority of its focus is within the school and especially directed at school lunches. On the website which shows the act, it says that over 31 million children receive meals through the school lunch program, and many of the children receive most, if not all, of their meals at school. And also claims that this legislation includes significant improvements that will help provide children with healthier and more nutritious food options, educate children about healthy food choices, and teach children healthy habits that can last a lifetime. The model of healthy food they use is shown here in this myplate.gov image, where they've sort of reworked the classic food pyramid and made this model where vegetables and whole grains are promoted as being the two items that you should consume the most, while you should be consuming less proteins, especially leaner proteins. You should be consuming more lean proteins and more fruits, and then dairy, and it should be low-fat or non-fat dairy. And this is the model that a lot of school lunches resemble. In fact, 90% of schools nationwide have adopted the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act as their school lunch policy. So after a few years of this Let's Move initiative having been implemented, and with so many schools having healthier school lunches, and there being so much movement towards more active lifestyles, you have to ask the question, is it working? Um, are the kids jumping around? Are they fitter? Uh, are they eating healthier foods? How successful have these initiatives been? And finding an answer to that question is actually kind of difficult. There are lots of websites which say that there really hasn't been much of an increase. Obesity has gone down, but not at a rate which is significant, and especially not within significant populations like minorities. The government, however, would argue that the changes are real and are significant and are meaningful. And I will quickly go through a few of the reasonings they have. Online, the USDA has a quote fact sheet on the implementations of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids initiative. The first fact says that kids are eating more fruits and vegetables as a result of the updated standards. A recent Harvard study has concluded this. Next, over 90% of schools have reported that they successfully are meeting the updated nutrition standards, so the schools here are self-reporting. Next, they make the claim that school lunch revenues are up. There's been a lot of concern that it's been costing way too much money having these new healthy implementations, but they're arguing that they've actually been increasing revenues and making money for schools because of the new policy, and this fact is based on a USDA analysis. Another one of their claims, which is again somewhat against popular outcry, is that healthy food standards have not increased food waste, and this is also founded by a recent study by the Harvard School of Public Health. They next say that participation is increasing substantially in many areas of the country, so more schools are participating in this initiative and offering healthy foods, and the USDA again is verifying this statistic. I think it's interesting that all of these facts are either founded by the USDA, who wrote this fact sheet, or are self-reported by schools who have a self-interest monetarily to participate and show participation enthusiasm in the program, and that Harvard is backing pretty much all of the studies, especially since the president went to school there and there are connections there, and that just seems somewhat significant. And this kind of reminds me of our discussions of the Hansen and Humphreys articles, where we talk about the imbalance of knowledge production and whose knowledge counts, and these are kind of dominant sources of knowledge. No one really questions Harvard, and they're supposed to be the know-alls of statistics and facts, and they're supposed to be correct all the time. If Harvard and the USDA, both groups with massive amounts of knowledge production power, say it's true, then it must be true. And it's interesting because they're saying these things at a time of change. The policies are in flux and things are changing, and as that John F. Kennedy quote points out, knowledge really is power in times of turbulence and change. So being able to rely upon their pedigree and their title is pretty important in supporting their facts. Even though all these facts and statistics are from expert sources of knowledge, people are not buying into them and they're not believing them. And I think it's partly because they're experiencing and seeing every day things that are counter to these statements. They see food being wasted in large quantities in school. Children tell their parents how much they don't like the school foods. School officials are going on news stations and publicly proclaiming that the new policies have caused large increases of waste in their schools and the lunches because students just don't want to eat the food that's given to them. In fact, there's been a recent trending of hashtag thanks Michelle Obama, where people post that hashtag attached to pictures of garbage cans full of food that's uneaten, or take pictures of school lunches that are unappealing and unappetizing, and post hashtag thanks Michelle Obama next to the pictures. While I think Michelle Obama has very, very little to do personally with the successes and failures of this initiative, I was surprised reading the fact sheets of what they were saying, that there wasn't a lot of waste, that it was successful in all these manners. From my experience working in an elementary school in DC, I was overwhelmed by the amount of waste, and I would say the vast majority of students didn't eat a lot of the food on their plate, and the majority of the food they didn't eat were the vegetables and the fruits. The picture at the top right of the little salad dish is one taken from a Charlottesville City Schools website, and it looks just like the small sort of box salads they would give to my students in after school. And I remember probably 1 out of 7 students would actually eat the salad, and the rest would just go directly into the trash can, and there would be a trash can completely filled with unopened, untouched greens and vegetables every single day. This problem exists locally also. Charlottesville City Schools and Albemarle County Schools are experiencing lots of difficulties with waste and school lunches. As the picture on the left shows, Buford Middle School created a sharing table because there was so much waste and kids were throwing away so much uneaten food that they wanted to at least give opportunity to other kids who did want to eat it more to grab the food that would have otherwise been wasted. But as one article points out, the sharing table turns into a, quote, healthy trash can, and it seems that students don't want to eat the food nearly as much as they're being given it. Some of the students also point out certain meals of the week that they do prefer and they do like, and they voice those opinions to the leaders of their schools, but are frustrated because oftentimes they're not heard. In my opinion, the reason this is failing is because people don't have enough autonomy. Millions of students are eating this food every day, and very few of them have any say in what they're putting into their bodies, and what we eat is one of the few things we really can control in our lives. Governments aren't searching for much help. They're relying mostly on expert knowledge. While these photos I have on this slide are funny, I think they do show that children can be helpful and can be useful and are creative, but oftentimes they're disregarded because they are seen as powerless. In our class discussions on Haraway, we talked about different situated knowledges, and we mentioned how race and class positions can be tough to work through, and I think also age positions can be different and tough to work through, and that provides another instance of vastly different situated knowledges. However, as we discussed in class, you should be able to recognize these differences and acknowledge political relationships and then keep moving forward. But is it reasonable to trust people who aren't even fully grown yet? Can you acknowledge their knowledge as being valuable and as being part of your community of knowledge? So can we solve this problem? Can we make food that students want to eat and that is affordable and healthy? While kids aren't going to magically stop being picky, I think there are ways we can transform school food so that it's more appetizing and appealing to students. And to do this, I think there's a degree to which food needs to be adapted to local tastes, and the students can help with that process. I learned this one day when I was working in DC, and I was dumping trays and trays of my students' lunch, and they'd been eating kale salad that day, and none of my students ate any of it, and I was just dumping it all into the trash can. And I began to eat my lunch with my students during our lunch clubs, and one of my students, Damon, asked me, "Hey, Mr. Xavier, can I have a bite of that?" And it was a cooked kale sauteed in some soy sauce, olive oil, ginger, and garlic, and I said, "No, Damon, you're not going to want any of this. I just dumped all your kale." And he said, "No, come on, please, Mr. Xavier, let me get a bite." And I was like, "Okay, fine, here you go, you can have a bite." And I gave him one, and he loved it. And all the other students at the table wanted to try some also. And out of probably a dozen, one didn't like it. And I thought, wow, I just fed them the stuff they threw away. It was presented a little differently, and it was made cool by one student, and it's amazing how they all just picked up on it. I think one key aspect of any development project is getting the developee involved, and there are a few ideas I had about how the kids, who are the ones really the recipients of the policy here, could get involved. There was an NPR news story on how taste testing was working in a school to help students find out a new recipe for eating carrots and a new way of eating carrots that was popular and widely accepted. So they did a taste test between 3 different types of carrots, and one of them was really popular among the students, and that got added to the menu. And so the picture on the right there with the students in the red shirts is an example of participation on the developee's part by having some aspect of choice in the development decision in the process. Another idea I was having, going a little deeper, was not only letting the kids sort of taste the things that are made, but letting the kids play a part in the decision-making process for what is being made in the first place. And that's complicated because kids don't know how to cook generally, especially younger ones in elementary school. And that's really the target population, is we want to be changing eating habits or improving eating habits at a younger age, so they'll continue as they get older. Experts say this all over. But it's challenging because young people don't really know how to cook. They don't have those skills yet, but their families do. And one thing would be interesting to ask students to go back home and get either their favorite or their parents' favorite family recipes and bring them into school, and there could be a sort of a recipe contest that could go, so the best recipes would get selected, the ones that were cooked the best and students like the most could be selected and added to the menu, or even family recipes from students could be given to professional local chefs, and through sort of a collaborative process, those recipes could be modified if they aren't, quote, healthy enough or fitting standards that schools have to adhere to. Could be modified by the chefs to fit those standards but still be resembling the original recipes that the students eat at home and of their favorite meals. One of the articles from Charlottesville Tomorrow talked about in Charlottesville city schools, students prefer home-cooked meals and preferred when the food in the school resembled scratch-made home-cooked meals. If students had the opportunity to eat something that was familiar and reminded them of home, sort of like the greens I'd cooked were familiar to Damon, my student, they might be much more likely to eat the food. And further, being part of the process of creating the menu could give the students a lot of pride and a lot of feeling of ownership over it, and empower them to eat more food and be more excited about the nutrition process, and would have more interest in their own health and nutrition. As disparate as I think the two ideas sound, there can be some connections drawn between our discussions in class about slums and the situations in a cafeteria. In our discussion about slums, we said they weren't just residential spaces, but productive spaces, and things move in and out, including ideas, people, commodities, and exchange happened in that space. I would argue that in cafeterias there is a similar exchange of ideas, and especially ideas about what is cool, what is good, and those ideas pertain to food specifically. When I was in the cafeteria, I would see my students exchange a lot of food and talk about each other's food. And if a group of students sort of stigmatized what another student was eating, that student, even if he was previously enjoying the food, would stop eating it because he felt like he wasn't being cool, or his mind sort of changed about whether or not the food was gross or whether it was appealing. And similarly, when food was brought in, especially when I would bring in food that some of my students had never seen before, they would immediately think it was gross and go, "Oh, what is that? What is that?" But after one or two would try it and then basically said they liked it, it would become sort of an inside thing and it would become cool. So I guess perhaps the point I'm making is that food not only can change and take on different realities in the minds of children especially, but it's important that it becomes cool or becomes culturally relevant, really, to these students. And I think there are a few ways that you can go around doing that. One is to bring them food which already has some cultural relevance. For instance, that time I fed Damon and those other students some of that cooked kale. One of the students who ate it and loved it said, "Mr. Xavier, are those collard greens?" And he told me that the reason he liked them was because they looked like collard greens and he loved the collard greens his mom would cook at home. So I think from that student's perspective he sort of owned, or that food was part of his culture. But I think that feeling of ownership and that feeling of closeness to food can be created also. It's not just a thing that comes from the family, but can be instilled in these students too. To empower students to feel ownership over their food and pride in what they're eating, you would want them to practice eating it and let their practice sort of shape what food ends up being in the cafeteria. This kind of goes back to what Moss talks about with practice shaping policy. And you'd hope that as the students got to experiment and learn and see what types of food they like and explore there and come together to decide what were good items for a menu, they would be able to craft their own menu, which would be more widely accepted than current ones are, and they would basically be able to just collaborate and work together to make something great. While this process will be done with local chefs and cafeteria staff hopefully, and even parents and administrative staff in the school, to make it a more well-rounded sort of group of people being able to put their knowledge and their input and their experience into it and to help generate something that's more complete, it's important to consider what Annie Doho said when it's written, "Community does not pre-exist in an essential form that can be readily harnessed for development purposes. It has to be purposely created, and it has to be created on the basis of shared meanings, not shared geography or demography." I shouldn't be able to assume that just because all these students go to school together and just because the parents live in the same community and just because the people in the school work in the same building that they will all be sort of like-minded and that they will share a pre-existing community and that one exists already. Rather, as a facilitator of a community of practice, I would need to talk and engage with individuals at the beginning and understand different points of view to help direct where the project goes. I would want to gauge their meaning of the project and their meaning of the change. Annie Doho writes, "It might have been useful for project facilitators to speak to individuals in an attempt to understand the diversity and depths of interpretations that would potentially exist in the group. I would want to talk with groups of students and teachers and administrators and cafeteria staff and try to get a shared meaning and create a community of practice and then figure out exactly what moves to take from there." Further, these moments of discussion and sort of group collaboration, it isn't just something that happens right at the beginning of a project. Annie Doho points out this idea of community maintenance, and I would need to come back to this discourse and to talking with people and getting their ideas and measuring progress and measuring how people are feeling about what the development project is doing and continuing to stay in contact and be in communication with these people. Whenever I tell people about my development project, there's always one bit that stands out the most and motivates people the most and gets people the most engaged in the idea I have and the project that I'm working on. And that's always the story I tell that I told earlier about Damon, my student asking to eat the kale, and the reaction all the other students had and how I saw change there. People don't get as excited or enthralled or enthusiastic when I tell them numbers or facts about the problems or the ways the solutions might be done. They get really, really interested once I start telling them stories about people, relationships, emotions. And I think that storytelling is not only as powerful as other ways of having narratives, such as giving facts or having numbers or statistics, but that those things, facts, numbers, and statistics, are also just ways of telling a story. As Nagar says, if one recognizes all theorizing as an exercise in storytelling, then it is also possible that the epistemic violence of existing paradigms and frameworks can be resisted, mitigated, or confronted by telling stories differently. Currently, a lot of the discourse and the development of this topic is about numbers and facts and these statistics. And while those are all important and true, I think they could be better paired and used in a sense of co-authorship with the stories of students from projects like this one. I think it would help us think about where power comes from and to help us consider that there's more besides these expert knowledges. As Nagar says, collaborative storytelling allows co-authors from varied locations to draw upon and scrutinize their multiple, sometimes conflicting, experiences and truths while exploring, enhancing, and elaborating upon how these interconnect with the, quote, expert knowledges. Far from seeking perfect resolutions or, quote, the final word, such an exercise requires us to confront the fact that power is never really external to dialogue, participation, or experience. I think it may be really beneficial to have the experiences and the participation of these students told in the forms of stories to help motivate change. Instead of focusing on some of the politics of what's happening right now, and it's moving more and more toward a sort of economic centered discussion, having these stories coming from these students might shift the focus back toward the recipients of the development, the ones actually eating the food, the students. In this sense, storytelling can be used as a leveler. Edward Carr talks about how stories and narratives have the power to decenter power relations. I love to tell my story about Damon, and it makes me feel empowered to do so. And it makes me feel like I'm making a difference, and I have power for change. And I'd love for that feeling to be within students also, as they're given the opportunity to tell their stories and to make a difference and express their power there. Unfortunately, I think there probably will be a lot of challenges to this type of project, both political and practical. The picture on the left with Michelle Obama shows kind of how decisions are currently made, and it's with a bunch of people who are in charge and in positions of power making decisions. A lot of school food is less so currently, but was more so in the past, determined on what there was excess of in the government. And it's kind of a funny idea to think that the government has an excess of food, because you don't really imagine government workers going out and farming and having too much food, but really it's these government subsidies, which are leftovers of food where they overproduce, and then those foods are often thrown onto the school system to be absorbed by them. And there's still a lot of money in this process and a lot of influence involved there, and it still has an impact on the process and the politics of school lunches. And there's also a pretty substantial practical problem that we might face in this project, or this idea, and that was brought up in the Seville Tomorrow article, which states that culinary skills among kitchen staff in schools are quite low, and they have very rudimentary skills, and they might not actually be capable, or they don't currently have the training required to cook beyond the ways they do currently, which is more like reheating. It's kind of this heat and eat sort of deal going on. But again, this is somewhat of a political problem because the training for these kitchen staff is definitely possible. It just costs money, and the funding to do that is something that is it's a political issue in government schools. And there are also a lot of sort of bureaucratic hurdles and hoops to jump through to do this kind of work, and a lot of coalitions, some I'm currently aware of and some that I'm sure I haven't been made aware of yet, that have an interest in keeping the system like it is and keeping the rules and the policies like they are. And some of those coalitions are quite powerful. However, I believe that through having good communities of practice and generating moving, passionate stories, we can change the tide of the political discourse and hopefully make policy changes also, and make students healthier and have a more flourishing initiative of the type that I think Michelle Obama really does envision.